Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. On today's episode of Central Booking, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and internationally best-selling author Kimberly Belle. Kimberly's newest novel of suspense, My Darling Husband, was a December Library Reads pick. It tells the story of Jade and Cam Lasky, whose seemingly perfect marriage is laid bare when a masked intruder invades their home and holds Jade and their two children hostage while Cam is tasked with amassing a sizable ransom. Secrets are revealed, sacrifices are made, and there's only one goal: survival. Kimberly is the author of 6 previous novels, including The Marriage Lie, which was a Goodreads Choice Awards semifinalist for Best Mystery and Thriller. Her books have been published in more than a dozen languages and optioned for television and film. Publishers Weekly called My Darling Husband a captivating thriller and said, "Several well-placed twists deliciously shake up the brisk plot, which smoothly moves among the viewpoints of Jade, Cam, and the kidnapper. Belle knows how to keep the pages turning." It seems only fitting, then, that you're about to fall under her influence, because Kimberly Belle knows a thing or two about the makings of a captive audience. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Central Booking. Today, I am delighted to be in conversation with USA Today and internationally best-selling author Kimberly Belle, whose new novel of suspense, My Darling Husband, is available right now. And there it is. Just looking at it makes you want to own this book. But welcome to the show, Kimberly. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It is my pleasure. So I figure we will start simply enough, and I am going to invite you and anybody who might be watching into our virtual elevator, and we're going to take a quick trip up. I hope it's the trip up. And you are going to have that opportunity to give us your personal elevator pitch for this new book.
Oh no, so much pressure. So My Darling Husband is about a woman named Jade who is basically confronted by a masked and armed man in her garage, and he forces his way into her home with her 2 children and demands a huge ransom sum from her husband.
That is a good pitch. I mean, you really do sort of get the gist of it right there. And then there's so much more to it as well. But I did want to ask you about the idea of home invasions, because it really is, it's quite terrifying, because it's somebody who's coming into the sanctity of your home and then chaos sort of ensues. And from what I gather, you spend part of your time in Atlanta, and apparently this is not really a rare occurrence there. It happens kind of commonly, which is also terrifying.
No joke.
I wanted to ask you about that because, and in I believe your acknowledgments, you even recognize the fact that this happened to friends of yours. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how you took this idea of a home invasion and used it as a launching point for a fictional novel.
Right. So, I'm under contract for multiple books typically. And when it comes time for me to actually write a book, I have to agree with my editor on what I'm going to write about. And this was actually her idea. She's the one who I had pitched a couple of ideas, and I kept getting shot down for all sorts of reasons. And finally, I've kind of flipped it back to her, and I said, well, why don't you tell me what you would like to see? And because every editor I've ever known has like a wish list of books that they would like to see. And so she sent me a list of maybe 5 to 10 things. And one of them was a mother protecting her family and her home from danger. And as soon as she said that, it just like plopped into my head. And part of it is, like you said, I live in Atlanta. This happens here, unfortunately, a lot, especially in the neighborhood where I set this book in Buckhead. And so, it was something that was kind of a little bit front of mind. And then we knew these people that it had happened to. And I actually used a little detail of their experience. I didn't want to write their story. I don't want to steal their drama, any of the, tragedy that happened to them. And they're fine. They're good. But, I did take one little detail from their story, and that was that their kidnappers, their invaders, asked for a very specific sum of money. And to me, that was like such an interesting detail, because it implies that these people, in their case, it was multiples. In this case, it's one man, that he knows something about the family that, maybe Jade isn't quite aware of at the time. And the longer this goes on in her home, and the more she, clues she picks up from this man, his name is Sebastian, the more she realizes, like, hey, this isn't random. He's not a stranger. There's something more going on here.
Sure, it is absolutely a terrifying thought, and I realized, wow, like I am so disillusioned about Atlanta. I've never been, and I think the only Atlanta I know is like the Atlanta from Designing Women. And considering they shot that in Hollywood, I think the only
That
thing
was a
Atlanta
minute
about
ago.
that, right? Like, yeah, that was like a minute or two ago, and I think the only thing in Atlanta was the house. Like they were never there.
Yeah.
But man,
Yeah.
yeah, it creeped me out. And I do want to ask you about some of the characters because there are such rich characters in this book. And so we have Cam, who is the husband, the father, the business owner. He's sort of the steak king of Atlanta. And the funny thing is, I don't know why I kept thinking Gordon Ramsay, even though they have like nothing in common other than food.
Right.
But I keep seeing Gordon Ramsay driving around in his truck screaming at people. But so anyway, Cam is sort of this celebrity chef, and he appears to be far more successful than he actually is. We sort of find this out as the book unfolds. But I'm wondering, when you write a book like this, you have to know a lot about the business that he's sort of inhabiting. So can
Yeah.
you talk about that world of restaurants and the research you had to do to bring that to life on the page?
Well, I didn't actually have to do a ton of research just because we know the real Atlanta Steak King. He is a friend of ours. His name is Kevin Rathbun. And like I said, he's a friend. We, hang out with him a lot. And so a lot of the details that I got, like the part about, I think Jade at some point says, wherever we go with him, it's like walking into the room with a rock star. Like people are buying you drinks, they want to take pictures with you, and that really happens. But I wanted to give Cam, an occupation, a job that made them highly visible in the community and maybe looked a little fancier and wealthier than they really were. When you're out every night in the restaurants and, living large, you attract a lot of attention and maybe not the attention from the right people. So that's why I made him the Atlanta Steak King. And I mean, it's kind of like, wink, wink to our friend Kevin, because everybody in Atlanta knows he's the real Steak King.
That's awesome. It's good to have friends. I'd always
Yeah.
love, yeah. And I
But
always
it
love
is
that.
also, and I know this from Kevin, he's doing great, but I do know that the restaurant business is one of those that, when you're expanding quickly, if you do it too quickly, you can get in a lot of danger and financial danger. I mean, and that is also a detail that I used in this story, because, like I said, the Sebastian demands this huge ransom sum from Cam within, I don't know, 3 hours, something like that, a crazy short amount of time, which is basically Mission Impossible. But I wanted to give Cam, like this, he wasn't in a position that he just had that kind of money lying around.
Yeah, and you really realize like what a high pressure job
Yeah.
that is, and sort of all consuming too. And so I figured, of course, we'll ask about Jade as well. And what I love about Jade is, she's very distinguished in her own right, but she's also happy to sort of step back from the spotlight, and she dotes on the kids, and she
Mhm.
supports Cam from home. And so it's easy to underestimate her, but she is a very strong wife figure, mother figure. And I'm wondering, if you can talk about how those roles sort of influence her sense of self, and then how that becomes increasingly important as the narrative unfolds and she sort of becomes super mom.
Right, right. Well, she, at the start of the story, she is, like you said, a stay-at-home mom. She is, completely taking care of the kids. That is her entire thing. She runs the house, and she is in, her previous career was in, decorating. So the house is a very important place for her, and making it a home and making it a place where her family wants to be. But she's also kind of has this internal struggle about, like, I had this career and now I gave it up for my kids, and the whole, I mean, I think any mother who's ever had a job has had these internal struggles. You want to be a mom, you want to be there for your kids, but you also want your own thing. And you're also maybe thinking about what other people are thinking about you. Oh, is she just a stay-at-home mom? Or, oh, is she leaving her kids to go to work? You know, I mean, there are all sorts of um, things going on in her own head. But she has made this decision. She wants to stay home for her kids and her daughter. She has two kids, and her daughter, the older of the two, is a musical prodigy, and she's this fabulous violin player, and everybody is, thinking that she's going to be like this big famous person someday. And so Jade also wants to honor that talent, but in a way that maybe she's struggling with how to keep her a child at the same time, because she's only, I think, 9 in this story. So she's got a lot going on in her head, and Cam has kind of protected her from the struggles in his business. So she's a little clueless about that part. But she's, like you said, a really strong woman. And those are kind of the characters I really love to write, is the women who don't realize they're so strong until they get stuck in this thing that they have to fight their way out of. And that's usually part of their character arc of the women that I write, is like discovering how strong they are. I think that's a really interesting and really crappy when you're going through it, but really interesting thing about any person is when you push their back up against the wall, how are they going to respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she's such a great character, and I love to see how her story, sort of evolves throughout the book. And so you mentioned the kids, and I did want to ask you about the kids, who they affectionately refer to as the Bees, because it's Baxter and Beatrix. And I love that, little bodies, but such big, strong personalities, and each very distinct from one another.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you can talk about your process in developing the children, so that not only, does that create sort of an emotional response within the reader, but also it really heightens the stakes as the story unfolds, because it's not just Mom and Cam, but there are these 2 kids in the house, and they play a huge role in what develops.
Right. Well, I wanted them to be a couple of things. First, young enough that they could not really take care of that they needed a little guidance from Jade, who is, by the way, tied to a chair in the other room. So, that automatically heightens the stakes, right? Because she is completely helpless to help her children. But I also wanted to make both of them really smart in their own way. Beatrix is, because she's this musical genius, she's super smart in other areas too. But both of the kids are maybe just a little, a little too brave for in this particular situation. They both do things that are maybe just a little terrifying for Jade and for the reader too, right? Because, I think anybody can, when you're reading a story like this, you automatically put yourself in that person's place. Even if you don't have kids, I think it would be hard to read a story like this and not feel some sort of like, that you want these kids to be okay. So yeah, I think kids in any danger story heighten the stakes, but especially if you give them a role, which both of these kids had in this story, where they maybe get into a little trouble. Yeah. That kind of, bumps it up a couple notches.
Yeah, it was great because, you sort of have this elevated sense of tension all throughout, but then the kids also provide a bit of comedic relief too, which is a lot of fun, because you go from like ripping your hair out to like, that's really funny, and slapping yourself on the leg. And then you remember, there's a masked intruder in the house, and maybe it's not all that comical.
Yeah.
But,
and speaking of comedic relief, I thought Sebastian had some of the best lines in the book. I don't know what they were. I can't remember what they were, but as I was writing him, I thought he was a really funny, sarcastic kind of guy. Yeah. Yeah. Not necessarily the best guy, but he had some good lines, I thought.
And it's really actually really like amusing to watch him interact with the children, and how he manipulates them and how maybe they manipulate him. Yeah, it's such an incredible dynamic in that house. There's a lot to enjoy there. Yeah. So let me ask you too about the narrative structure, because it really is 3 perspectives. So you have Jade, Cam, Sebastian, who you mentioned is the intruder, and then also it's interspersed with some interview clips between Cam and a local reporter. But just wanted to ask you, what appealed to you about this particular structure? And then, when you have sort of multiple voices and perspectives, how much pre-planning do you do versus letting it develop organically as you're sitting down and writing?
So I do a lot of planning. As a matter of fact, everything was already like totally written out chapter by chapter. So I knew exactly whose chapter was next, what was going to happen in that chapter. So I write from a pretty detailed outline. That's not to say that nothing ever changes as I'm writing it, because I actually did make a couple of kind of big changes in the story, and I don't want to say it without I would give some things away, but at the halfway mark, the whole second half, there was a big thing that I changed in that, because one of my beta readers, who's another author, Emily Carpenter, she gave me a really great idea, and so I ran with it. But that part wasn't in my outline, but the rest really was, except for the interview chapters with Cam. That was something that came at the very end after I had written the whole story. And I felt like it just needed a little something extra, a little sprinkle on top. And so I came up with the interview, which is basically Cam being interviewed by a television reporter, right? So you know that he survived. You know that this happened to him and he's dealing with the fallout, but you don't quite know the whole story. So that's something I went through and wove in at a much later time. Did I answer all your questions? Because I can't remember.
Absolutely. I can't remember what I asked you. That's what happens when I ask those multi-part questions. No, but you absolutely did. And it's funny that you added the interview segments later. I loved those. They were almost like a palate cleanser, just because it's a little bit shorter after the extended chapters. But yeah, it does add a sort of another element of suspense, because you know a little bit about how the story turns out, but you're getting sort of piecemeal these little clues. And so it really makes your mind work. So I thought that worked really well. So another thing I wanted to ask you, I mean, as people are probably gathering, none of the characters in this book, particularly the adults, are without fault. I mean, who of us is? Nobody. And, it doesn't matter if we see them as the good guy, the bad guy, or somewhere in between that. But I'm wondering, too, if you can talk about the process, of developing characters, who have flaws or quirks, and then sort of balancing that out with more redemptive qualities. So even if you don't necessarily like who the character is or what they're doing, you do feel some kind of empathy or sympathy for them.
Right. Well, so I'm going to leave Jade out of this, because in my mind, she's the real heroine. Like, this happened to her. She has, I think, of the three characters, probably the least amount of flaws. I mean, everybody has flaws, right? But I think she's kind of, the one that everybody is rooting for all the way through. Her husband, Cam, has been keeping secrets. I love writing about, it's kind of my shtick, writing about, these marriages where, one of them is keeping a secret, someone did something bad, there's some sort of betrayal. I just think that there are a million different ways a story like that can go. And so I love exploring those kind of relationships. Cam definitely has his flaws. He maybe is a little too preoccupied with the whole money and the status and all that. And although, I mean, Jade wasn't complaining when he bought this big house and, lived this big lifestyle. She wasn't complaining, but I think, he seemed to be the main driver behind that, which actually fits very well with, the restaurateur kind of career. But I love writing from a villain's point of view. So Sebastian in this case, but giving him a really good reason for doing a really bad thing. And that was my starting point with him when I was creating him. I wanted him to look like a really bad guy from the get-go, which he is, right? He's got a mask and a gun. So, I mean, what could be worse than that? He's pointing it at children, So I wanted, from the get-go, he's a bad guy. But the more we get to know him, the more we see that he's got real reasons for doing what he's doing. And a lot of them kind of run parallel to Cam's reasoning for, running around town, maybe acting a little wealthier than he is, and doing all he's doing to pull together the ransom. They're kind of both really just, wanting to protect the people that they love. And I mean, who can fault anyone for that, right? It's maybe
Right.
his methodology is maybe not so great, but ultimately their reasons are kind of the same.
Yeah,
Motivations.
yeah, and then you can really understand and sort of relate to it. And one of the things I really like about this book is there's, sort of that juxtaposition of appearances versus reality. And you look at Jade and Cam and their home and you think, oh, privilege and prosperity and protection, but it's all an illusion and it all just, kind of falls away. And then you realize how temporary some of that stuff really can be. But let me
Right.
ask you too. So what I really enjoy about this book is there's a real ticking time clock element to it, because Cam, has to deliver a very specific amount of money at a very specific time. So really the majority of the action takes place over a span of a very few hours. So
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you, how'd you go about establishing the book's pacing? Because I'm sure that's got to be tricky to do. And did you find that it was, having such a narrow window of time to work within, did you find that that was helpful to you or more challenging given the need to really inhabit every moment that those characters live?
I actually like the short, time span in a book. I mean, I've written books. This is probably the shortest I've written, but I've written books where, 3 days missing. It happens in 3 days. I think The Marriage Lie was a span of maybe 2 weeks. Dear Wife, I don't remember. But, I mean, I tend to choose these short windows of time. That's just the way my brain works, I think, when I'm coming up with a story. 3 hours is really short. I didn't have a problem with the pacing and fitting it into 3 hours. What I had a problem with, because every chapter starts with, I think, a time. Does it
Right.
start with a time?
Yeah, they do.
And yeah, and so as I was doing the edits, my editor was like, well, this could never happen in a span of 3 minutes. This is more like 17. And so we had to like really go back and, think through the clock part of it. And the joke was, remind me next time I do this to never put a timestamp on my chapters ever again, because it's really hard that way. But I actually really, I like the tight time frame of a story. I think that especially when you're working with a time limit like this, he had to bring the money home by 7 o'clock. I think that really works to, especially in a suspenseful thriller kind of story, to really drive things home. Like, holy crap, you better hurry, and that just adds to the tension, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because some people say in situations like that the time goes so quickly, but it also stands still. And so, you're taking sort of a mental inventory of all these things that are happening and that you would probably, never otherwise realize. And you really see that, with Jade, which is really kind of cool. I mean, each minute just drags on, but in a way that's very compelling.
Right.
So that was cool, and it was different than, a lot of the books in this genre. So to
Yeah.
speak a little bit more generally, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you, you yourself are a wife and a mom. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how you draw on, the emotions and experiences that come with that to inform your books, even though they are fiction, because there is that essence of truth.
Hmm. Yeah, I think, anybody who's ever been a parent or has ever had someone that they're caring for, um, I think they can understand what that kind of feels like. So I definitely draw a lot of that to write these books. I do write about children typically who are much younger than mine. Mine are big and grown and out of the house. I'm not sure I could have written these books when they were this age.
Sure.
Same with 3 Days Missing. That was a book that, I wrote it. My son, I have a son. He was, in college at the time, I think, when I wrote that. So it was easier for me to kind of put a little bit of distance between my motherly, caring for a small child and writing this story where a small child is in real danger, but somebody asked me this the other day, like, does it scare you when you're writing these things? And it doesn't really when I'm actually in the weeds of writing, because by then I already know my whole story and I know where I'm going and I know how it's going to end. And you know, also the writing part is so technical. I'm not really thinking about the scariness part. It does frighten me sometimes when I think of these things. I'm like, oh God, where did this story come from? Or when I'm, thinking through all the danger plot points as I'm creating my outline. But the actual writing part never really scares me. I actually know a lot of romance authors too, and they're, same with them. They're like, oh no, I don't have the hots for this guy as I'm writing a sex scene, because it's all choreography. It's, technical stuff. So you don't really feel the feelings, I think, as you're writing it. At least I don't.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's not so sexy when you're writing that scene like 2 weeks later, you're still in the same scene. It's like,
exactly
done. Let it end. But yeah, it's interesting to get your perspective on that, just because, I have a lot of friends who are writers, and two of them are very good friends, and you probably know them, but Wendy Corsi Staub and Allison Galen, and they have like completely different perspectives on that. Wendy, who's written, something like 90 books, like she'll say that anything that, terrified her about sort of domestic life, she would work it into a novel, because then she would believe if she wrote about it, it would never happen.
Wouldn't happen.
That's why she's so young and has this many books. And then Allison, on the other hand, would say, she couldn't write about children that were the same age as her daughter until she was grown. So it's just,
I get that. I 100% understand that, because I have the same thing. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, all right, more general questions. I am not too familiar with your background, so I'm wondering if you just wouldn't mind sharing, a bit about what drew you to writing and how you knew that this was the life that you wanted for yourself.
Yeah. So this is my second career. I worked for many, many years in nonprofit fundraising. That was kind of my thing for a really long time. And I've always been a reader. I've always, kind of had this like secret dream, but for a really long time, it kind of felt like a pipe dream. I was like, I have a story to tell, maybe a story, maybe two, we'll see, and I kept putting it off. I got married, I had kids, I had a mortgage, I had all these things that I had to do. And then in 2008, I was doing consulting for a bunch of nonprofits here in Atlanta, and the market crashed, and literally overnight I lost every single client, like up in smoke. I woke up the next morning, I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do now? And we were at a place where, our kids were older. We didn't really need my immediate income every month coming in. So I thought, well, I can go out and get a job, but maybe this is also the universe telling me that it's time to do this thing that I've always kind of secretly dreamed of doing. So I said to my husband, I was like, I think I'm going to write a book. And he was like, what? You're going to do what? So I sat down and I thought, I have no idea what I was doing. So, I studied a lot. I read everything I could get my hands on. I took a lot of courses. And I, wrote a book, and that was a practice book that will never see the light of day. And it took me a while to figure out, because I read all genres. This wasn't immediately my genre. My first two books kind of straddle the line between women's fiction and romance and suspense. They have little fingers in all three of those genres. And so, I kind of played around before I kind of found my thing. But like I said, that was 2008, and then my first book came out in 2014. So it tells you a little bit about how long it took me. It's just, it's a long road before you find an agent, before you get published, the whole thing. Somebody once said to me, and this is really true, the most successful authors aren't necessarily the best, they're the most persistent.
Sure. And you have to be.
Yeah.
And, I love that you share that story though too, because it reminds people that writing doesn't have to be your first career. It doesn't have to be your only career. It doesn't have to be the career that sustains you. And, it's funny. I mean, leave it to a market crash to make writing look like a stable career.
Right. Like a get rich quick scheme, right?
Yeah, 6 years later, the book comes out, but man, it is a waiting game. So I guess if you can wait, you have a better chance of winning the game. And you answered my next question, because I was going to ask you, if the books that you write are a reflection of the books that you read, but it sounds like, you read a great scope of things. But are there any books, in the vein of your own that you would recommend to people who really enjoy your books and are maybe looking for
Oh
something
my
similar?
gosh, so many. I'm looking around on my, okay, so Janelle Brown, Pretty Things, loved it. Wendy Walker, Don't Look for Me. I'm looking on my shelves over there. And I just picked up, I'm reading it now, A Flicker in the Dark. Have you read that one yet? It came
Oh, it's
out
in my
today, I
pile.
think.
It is out today. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one that I'm like, I don't know, a third of the way in, loving it.
Awesome. Great. I know we always more recommendations. The books in this house are like overtaking everything else. It's terrible.
I know, I know. And you know, I'm sure I could come up with a lot more, but I would have to consult my list.
It's like it would risk the book avalanche. That happens all the time here. I'm like, we're just lucky if we're not under it.
But I do on my Instagram, I do and Facebook on a Facebook group, I do a top 5 new releases for the month. At the end of the month, I come out with my top 5. And they're not always suspense thrillers. I usually have 1 or 2. Sometimes it's a memoir, sometimes it's romance. It just kind of depends. But I choose my top 5. So if you're ever, you can find all that on my Instagram for every month.
Oh, that's awesome. It's such a fun way to promote books too. You know,
Yeah.
you've got great pictures and it just really pops, which is terrific.
And an excuse to read a lot.
Yeah,
I don't need an excuse, but
I'm constantly telling me I'm working. I have to interview somebody or review this book. It's work. She's like,
Mommy's working.
In bed reading. Like, come on.
That's work too. I actually really honestly consider it work. I need to know what's happening in the genre. I need to know what books are out there.
It is. There you go.
Yeah.
There's affirmation, validation. Thank you so much. It's the real purpose for doing these interviews.
Exactly.
So just a couple more questions, and then I will let you get back to your books. You may have touched upon this a moment ago, depending on how you answer it, but I wanted to ask you, people are always looking for guidance or advice. So in looking back, what would you say is the best advice in terms of a creative or writing life that you've ever gotten, and then the best advice that you never got and sort of had to learn for yourself throughout the process of doing the writing?
So for writing, for the actual writing advice, I think the best advice I got, and I don't even remember who gave it to me, probably heard it from multiple places, is, you know, to really not to wait till the muse hits, not to wait until you feel inspired, but like sit your butt in the chair every day and type and just write. And, you know, there are going to be a lot of days where you don't really get much done and where everything you produce is crap. But there are also going to be a lot of days that, you know, you really move the story forward. And so, you know, I've always done that. I've always been, when I'm actually writing a book, I'm in my chair, you know, a good 8 hours a day, actually doing the work. So that was the writing advice. The other advice that, I'm not sure anybody ever told me this. I've talked about it a lot with my writing friends, because I do have a lot of author friends, and when I say talk about it, maybe we bitch about it. But, you know, one of the things that I have had to learn, and I'm still, it's a struggle. It's a constant struggle. It's so easy because we're like, I'm in a room by myself. And so I'm very much projecting outward and looking outward on social media and, you know, talking to other people online, watching what other people are doing online. And it's so easy to see what other authors are doing and to get caught up in that. So like on Twitter, people say, I had 5,000 words today. And then, you know, I'm like, well, I had 25. So it's so hard to not get discouraged sometimes, and to not compare yourself to what everyone else is doing. And so that is something I'm constantly telling myself. I don't think I've learned that lesson yet, but it's something that I work on constantly. Is, you know, like everybody has their own journey. Everybody has their own. There are a million ways to get from A to B, and you got to figure out your own way, and you got to do your own thing, and it's all good.
Good advice. And it's so true. I mean, it's funny. Social media can be such a distraction. And I tell myself that as I'm clicking onto, you know, Facebook.
Exactly. You just scroll.
And 2 hours later, I haven't even gotten 25 words. Somehow, you know, I'm in the whole 25 words. But All right.
Exactly.
So final question. So we talked all about your new book, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind leaving us with a little teaser of what comes next for you.
Yes. So I am working on a story and I'm almost there. I'm so close to sending it to my editor. It is a story about a woman who is an influencer on Instagram, and she lives this very visible life. And uh, one day, a post of hers just hits all wrong, and she ends up in this social media pylon. It goes viral, and all the trolls come. And as the story progresses, the danger becomes more and more real. And then her personal assistant goes missing.
Oh, wow.
And yeah.
Sign me up.
And like I said, it's a story about putting yourself out there and the dangers of, being that visible with strangers, people who, you don't really know, but who know you all too well.
Wow, that's very timely. I know, given cancel culture and just the fact that, you say something and even if somebody just takes it the wrong way, even if it's not what you intended, man, yeah, there's no taking back anything once it's online. It just kind of exists forever.
And try to turn that train around when everybody starts piling on, even if it's not what you meant to say or they take it the wrong way, it's almost impossible to turn it around.
Yeah, it's like the train has left the station and there is
Exactly.
no going back. Wow, that is exciting for sure. So I will be looking forward to that. In the meantime, people can pick up My Darling Husband, which is available right now. You will lose sleep. You will miss your nap. It will be worth it. You will forgive Kimberly Belle for that. Thank you so much for being here. It was a real pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was fun.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.